further ado, I'm so excited to introduce our guest this evening, Nabila Ramdani, French journalist and the author of Fixing France. Thank you so much for joining us at the Trouble Club.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure, and I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's so kind of you all to come along this evening, and thank you very much for having me in this absolutely stunning venue. I couldn't agree anymore. I have to say it's actually pretty moving for a French-Algerian like me to be discussing my new book about modern France in the Trouble Club. French establishment figures frequently refer to people like me as trouble, and this has certainly happened a lot since my book came out. And in fact, it got me into so much trouble that I'm a bit worried they won't let me back on the Eurostar when I try to get back to Paris. But Soho has always been a key reception area for successive waves of dissenting exiles from France, including plenty of authors such as Émile Zola and indeed Voltaire, who lived around the corner on Covent Garden. And the title of my book is Fixing France, How to Repair a Broken Republic, so it clearly follows in that tradition. Gallic dissidents moved to London because it was noted for its tolerance and its freedom of expression, and because Britain was always home of the great, it was always one of the great immigrant nations, to put it simply. And it might annoy a few people for me to say that, but it's absolutely true. French migration to London has always reflected French politics, from the persecution of the Huguenots in the 16th century to royalists and Catholic clergy escaping the guillotine in the 1789 revolution. Then there were anarchists who had to get away following the destruction of the Paris Commune in 1871, and of course the Second World War, exiles who included General Charles de Gaulle himself. The Free French were all over Greek Street, especially in l'Escargot restaurant, a few doors along from here. A great Francophile whom I always associate with central London is Mary Wollstonecraft. This magnificent 18th century writer features prominently in my book, not least of all because of the way she attacked the 1789 revolutionaries for failing to take up the cause of a female emancipation. It is said that well-behaved women seldom make history, and I think that's absolutely true. And the very troublesome Mary Wollstonecraft would have loved the Trouble Club. Wollstonecraft travelled across the English Channel to see the biggest historical event of her life and how it might have advanced gender equality, and was originally very impressed by a daring social experiment. She even thought it might be repeated in Britain. But it soon became clear to her that women were excluded from the so-called universal Republican ideology, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen only applied to men over 25 who paid an appropriate amount of tax, for example. And it is such injustices that prompted Wollstonecraft to write A Vindication of the Rights of Women, which is an extraordinarily radical work of literature that argued, and I quote, "It is time to effect a revolution in female manners, time to restore to them their lost dignity and make them as a part of the human species, labour by reforming themselves to reform the world." Great historical figures such as Wollstonecraft and exiles to London such as de Gaulle are discussed at length in my book, but I also focus on less celebrated immigrants, particularly persecuted Algerians who were displaced from France and indeed from France's African empire during the Algerian War of Independence. This group of people is given great importance in my book not least of all because the horrifically violent conflict between Algerian nationalists and French colonizers literally brought the Fifth Republic, which is the current iteration of Republican France, into being. France was on the verge of civil war in the late 1950s. French nationalists wanted to hang on to Algeria, the jewel in France's imperial crown, while millions of others, not least of all Algerian nationalists, said it should be liberated. Hence, de Gaulle, the Second World War hero, coming out of the wilderness to create a new republic presided over by a king-like alpha male with incredible powers. And it is this kind of presidential government which continues to this day, with Emmanuel Macron pretty much doing what he wants. He can bypass parliament and rule by decree, he can choose his prime minister, he can appoint his cabinet ministers, and they don't even have to be elected politicians. They can be cronies too. He has a massive security state behind him, and many of the paramilitary units within the security apparatus were originally designed to clamp down on unruly Algerians, and prejudice against them still continues. My North African background certainly excludes me from France's national story. I was born in France to Algerian parents. I was educated in Paris. I have a French passport. I can think in French. Being French is very much a mode of thought and indeed expression. Yet there are many French people who do not acknowledge that I am French because of my origins, because of my appearance, and many people like me are literally pushed into lives on the periphery. Worse than that, we are often stigmatized and portrayed in all kinds of unpleasant ways. And my early views of the French Republic, before I got to meet power players such as Emmanuel Macron, were from one of the neglected suburbs of Paris. And accordingly, my first memories are of concrete residential blocks. I make such points very strongly in my book, but fear not, Fixing France is by no means a misery memoir, nor a series of complaints. And in fact, the book is ultimately a call for change. And in that sense, it's very positive and at times pretty optimistic. I'd love another Belle Époque, if only for the Art Nouveau and the Impressionist paintings. My book, in fact, analyzes lots of key subjects. Politics is, of course, clearly crucial, but there are 10 themes explored in 10 chapters, and they include economic injustice, segregated suburbs, the state of French feminism and the debasement of women, terrorism, institutionalized rioting and paramilitary policing, deep-seated racial and religious discrimination, and the rise of the far right as exemplified by Le Pen and her political party, her dynastic party even. In other words, my book doesn't shy away from very difficult issues. And I know that sometimes discussing those issues can cause immense pain and anguish for many, as well as, division and discord. But the easy option is always to avoid getting involved. But I really think that we all owe to the world to try and join the debate and indeed try to make a difference. And that's really the purpose of my book. I've tried to make my book as honest as possible and to write it in a way that will appeal to anybody, no matter what their background. The state of feminism anywhere is always a good barometer of a country's fortunes. And the subject, quite rightly, gets a whole chapter in my book, and indeed features all over it. women's rights have developed extremely slowly in France, despite successive revolutions. And as Mary Wollstonecraft soon discovered, the country's expertise at overthrowing rulers in 1789 certainly didn't extend to defeating the patriarchal system. And this was despite Marianne, a female incarnation of freedom, coming to symbolize the Republic. This fantasy figure was given the most popular girls' names of the late 18th century, Mary and Anne, and was not afraid of taking to the barricades. The most famous version of Marianne is in Liberty Leading the People, the painting of the romantic artist Eugène Delacroix, which is now in the Louvre. Marianne is waving the tricolour flag and holding a musket with a fixed bayonet during the Revolution of July 1830. And she now takes pride of place in most buildings across France. There are depictions and sculptures of her bust in law courts, prefectures, city halls, and she's also on the official government logo and indeed on stamps. Up until 1969, the identity of this superwoman was deliberately kept mysterious. Anonymity created an aura of universalism in line with France's values. But then President de Gaulle approved a sculpting workshop in the Louvre, turning international sex symbol Brigitte Bardot into the national image. De Gaulle had met Bardot at a dinner once at the Élysée Palace at the end of 1967. Bardot ostensibly united the country, north and south, because she was a Parisienne who had spent all her summer holidays with her prosperous parents on the Riviera in Saint-Tropez and La Baule. And the press portrayed Bibi, as she became known, as a blonde bombshell rival to Marilyn Monroe, as well as the personification of French womanhood. How unfortunate, then, that Bibi now has multiple convictions for racism and a record of mocking women who complain about sexual harassment. She particularly detests Muslims and she wants to see foreigners deported. Bibi has also been reprimanded for insulting members of the LGBT community. Bibi, older and nastier, might certainly still qualify as a Marianne bust. She epitomizes a country with a far from impressive gender equality record, and one in which thousands of complaints about sexual violence are made every year. Police reported a 10% increase in the number of domestic attacks in 2020, with 159,400 victims. 87% of them, or 139,200, were women. Bardot is a National Rally voter. The party was formerly known as the National Front and was founded by Jean-Marie Le Pen, a convicted racist and an anti-Semite. Bardot has watched the success of the far-right increase in line with attacks on women, especially Muslim ones. Patriarchal structures remain very strong indeed in France, particularly in politics, and there can be as many votes in sexism as there are in racism. There has never been a female president in France, and only 2 distinctly low-key women have ever been prime minister. Edith Cresson resigned in April 1992 after a disastrous 10 months and 18 days in the job. 30 years later, Elizabeth Bourne was appointed, and she's rightly referred to as a Macron puppet. Meanwhile, France's obsession with its own brand of secularism, and indeed an often absurd form of feminism, oppresses a huge section of the population. And these include Muslim women who are literally criminalized for their choice of clothing. The great contradiction in French feminism discourse, whether it's argued by the left or indeed the right, is that it uses laïcité or secularism as a tool to allegedly protect and emancipate women from supposedly repressive males, while also stigmatizing and penalizing those same women. There are plenty of perfectly liberated French Muslim women who choose to wear headscarves or indeed modest clothing, and yet they are branded as victims of an oppressive culture and religion. And so it is that France excludes female citizens from public spaces because of their clothes, using fines and the threats of prison to enforce its diktats. The battles for women's liberté and égalité were often won in a stuttering, unsatisfactory manner. French women got the vote in 1944, but the indigenous Muslim women of rench-Algerian, as these citizens who were considered second class were called, did not get it until 1958. Follow your dreams, said Elizabeth Bourne when Macron appointed her Prime Minister in 2022. Nothing must slow down the struggle for women to be prominent in society, she added. But there were no references to structural or indeed cultural problems. The implication was that women merely lacked ambition. Edith Cresson, who was France's first ever female prime minister, was 88 by this time, and she was quick to highlight how sexist the Republic still was. When it became clear that Macron was going to hand the prime minister's office home to a woman, she said, "It's not the country that is macho, it is its political class. There were the same attacks as there are today. I was under permanent criticism. They commented on my dress. We would never allow the same thing, the same comments on the dress of male politicians. When we talk about women, we talk without embarrassment about their clothes or their appearance." And she concluded, "The post of Prime Minister is a very difficult position in any case. And then if the difficulties are increased by the fact that the head of government is a woman, it complicates the political situation even more. If a woman were to be appointed again, I will not give any advice. I simply tell her that she will need a lot of courage." In a nutshell, the clearest message I'd like to offer you tonight about my book is that it highlights a whole host of fault lines like these ones as far as France is concerned. But I also point to plenty of solutions. It's a very straightforward read. It is not a stodgy academic book. It is not a political manifesto. In fact, it just highlights my real life experiences and indeed why the modern republic is failing to live up to its own once exalted reputation of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. So I really do hope that you'll enjoy it, and I would like to thank you again for coming tonight and supporting me.
Thank you so much.